icons, is the closed captions. Anyway, are we on yet, or we still?
You guys want me to?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So next to
Just
the
want me
camera,
to test the sharing
to the
screen?
camera, just touch that one, and that will take off the closed captions. Yeah.
I think we should let people in now, right?
You'd have to move the slides. So then you say they Brother Sheikh, you can start now. Just stop sharing now.
Okay, yeah, okay, you can stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Maybe we let few more minutes to our colleagues are still joining. So I think, Dr. Arif, maybe we can start by the time we finish with the opening remarks. Maybe more colleagues will be with us. So I would like to invite Dr. Arif to share his opening welcoming remark. Okay, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of the Islamic Development Bank Institute and the Islamic Development Bank, I would like to welcome one and all to today's webinar. We're very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Fadel Kaboub, and I would like to thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us today and share his perspectives on two very important interrelated challenges, that being structural transformation and the just transition, with a particular focus on Africa. Now, this topic is particularly relevant and crucial to us, not just because these are two interrelated challenges, but it's of critical importance, not just to our member countries in Africa, but also the rest of our member countries as they grapple with the challenges across several dimensions, including food, technology, and infrastructure, all of which are critical in their quest for sustainable economic growth. Now, these challenges are not new. They've been around for decades. And so have the multilaterals and various development institutions. And a lot of money has been poured into trying to tackle these challenges. However, we still haven't seen decisive solutions to these challenges. And these are starting to raise more and more questions these days in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of our interventions and the approaches to tackling them. Questions being asked include, have we done our diagnosis properly? Are the strategies we are adopting correct, or have we figured the implementation side? This is a very complex issue, and there's a lot of unresolved issues. And we have with us today the experts, Dr. Fadel, who hopefully would share with us his thoughts on all of this. And then we also have our colleagues from the bank who would share their perspectives and some issues around what the bank is doing. So a special word of thanks to Sheikh for his perseverance in getting Fadel to join us today, but also for agreeing to moderate this very important event. And thanks to the colleagues behind the scenes, Abdul Rashid, Knowledge Horizons, Brother Mahmoud, who do a lot of work behind the scenes, and the communications team to bring these webinars and these knowledge sharing sessions to colleagues in the bank. So, Sheikh, before we hand over to you, just want to thank Fadel once more for joining us today and agreeing to share his thoughts. I'm sure it's going to be very insightful, and we're going to have some very dynamic discussions post his intervention. And I look forward to following this quite closely and successful discussion. Inshallah, hopefully some good comes out of this, and we can change course or sharpen our tools as we move forward. So back to you, Sheikh. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rai. So with this word, you have made my job easy as moderator. So the topic is very, very well introduced, as you mentioned. For us working on country diagnostic studies and member country partnership strategy, we know that structural transformation is the key issue for our member countries. And now with all these emerging issues related to climate change, I think the topic, as you mentioned, is very relevant. And for this, we have a very, very seasoned expert. We are honored and privileged to have Dr. Fadel Kabu. So Fadel is an associate professor of economics at Denison. So I understand that he's on leave, and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So he has also a research affiliation with John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the Economic Research Forum in Egypt, among others affiliation. Fadel holds a PhD in economics and social consortium from University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is an expert on designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty, building resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. So all these areas that we will be discussing. So his recent work focuses on just transition, climate finance, and transforming global trade, finance, and investment architecture. So this is Dr. Fadel, who will be our main speaker today. So with him in the panel, we have two of our colleagues, also seasoned experts in this area. First of all, Dr. Imed Green. He is Associate Manager leading the Regional Integration Team at ISDB. So Imed holds a PhD in Economics from Sorbonne University, and he served previously as Research Fellow at the United Nations University, World Institute for Development Economics Research in Finland. He also served as Associate Professor of Economics and Head of Department at the University of Sousse in Tunisia. And also in the panel, Dr. Bradley Hiller, who is the lead climate change specialist at ISDB. So he leads our work on climate change and supports climate adaptation, climate finance, and environmental safeguard activities across our 57 member countries. Previously, Brad Lade has experience with the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, and Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Bradley's contribution to sustainable development have been recognized by being awarded a G20 Global Leadership Fellowship. So among others award, I will not mention them all. So he has been a visiting fellow at Global Sustainability Institute, and he has a PhD from the University of Cambridge. So here is our panel today, and we'll start with Dr. Fadel. So Fadel, you have about 30 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, and welcome again.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the warm introduction. I will start by sharing my screen, and hopefully this will display properly. There you go. I'll try to close these things. Okay. Is everything displaying properly on your end?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. So as you all know, our theme today is to link these two important themes, which is structural transformation in developing countries and the global South in general, and in particular for member states of the Islamic Development Bank. This is just as relevant as the conversation we're having here in Africa, linking structural transformation with just transition. And perhaps we should talk about just transitions plural, because there's multiple transitions, and underlying the concept of justice in just transition, which implies that we've been operating in a system that's been unjust, that's been creating socioeconomic exclusion for millions of people around the world. So we want to transition to a system that is inclusive, that is sustainable, and that delivers prosperity for all, as opposed to the kind of inequality we've been struggling with. The good news is that this conversation that we're having about transition and transformation is slowly becoming the core conversation on a global scale, especially within the international financial institutions. Except we're not really at the transformation level yet. We're still talking about reform of the global financial architecture. And we're hoping that with more of this work and more of this deep dive conversation, we'll get to convince our leaders across the world that we need transformation, not simple reform. So with that, let me start with my main message, which I summarize usually in 3 bullet points. And this is kind of high level, punchline that I'll try to unpack. So the first one is, we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. And I'm talking about economically decolonized, and I'll unpack what that means for us. Similarly, we can't democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet, economically and structurally. And similarly, especially that today a lot of people are talking about de-dollarization of the global financial system. We can't de-dollarize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. That doesn't mean we decolonize and then do the other stuff later. It means that simultaneously we have to think in terms of transformation, structural transformation. And what I'm arguing in this work is that the economic development model of the global South, of Africa in particular, is still structurally colonized, and we haven't really successfully decolonized it structurally yet, in order for us to tackle all the other national, regional priorities on the climate front, on the democracy front, on so many national priorities. And a lot of this work comes from this report called Just Transition, which I've shared with the participants here. It's available in French and English, available online on justtransitionafrica.org. This was a team of independent experts on just transition and development, led by our senior colleague, Dr. Yuba Sukona, who's the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC from Mali. And notice the subtitle here is really the main message of this work. We're trying to essentially argue that we cannot have these conversations, siloed conversations about climate policy separate from energy policy, separate from development policies. We have to have a coherent, comprehensive vision of structural transformation that tackles all of these issues simultaneously. And that's really the main message. And what I'm presenting today, a lot of it comes from this report. I'll start with the climate issue, and then we'll move into the energy and development issues. The UN environmental program a couple of years ago produced this report called Production Gap, and it's available on productiongap.org. And it delivers a simple message presented in this simple graph, which is the gap between how much the world is planning to extract and burn in terms of fossil fuels by 2030, 2040, and so on, versus how much we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to keep global warming at the 1.5 degree limit or at the 2 degree limit that scientists tell us we cannot exceed. And the gap is the gap between the two. And clearly, the science is very clear in terms of how we're going to close that gap. Two things. Number one, we have to stop adding additional fossil fuel infrastructure immediately. The problem is, the reality is, we're actually adding new fossil fuel infrastructure at the tune of close to $1 trillion for the last 10 years and continuing at the same pace. Most of it, by the way, is in North America. So that's problem number one. The second recommendation from this report, which is designing a plan to rapidly phase out the use of fossil fuels. And that is why there's a momentum now for this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative, which allows countries to sit down and negotiate an orderly phase out of fossil fuels, a just phase out of fossil fuels that takes into account not only the workers in the fossil fuel industry that will be affected, but also developing countries that haven't used their carbon budget yet and don't have the economic wherewithal to transition rapidly without assistance. And number two, also assisting countries that are heavily dependent on oil exports to design a rapid phase-out plan and an economic transformation plan, therefore a just transition also for those countries. So I encourage all of you to take a look at it. And increasingly now we have close to 10 countries that have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, and even more cities around the world. Hundreds of Nobel laureate scientists, faith groups from all major religions have endorsed the idea of negotiating a fossil fuel treaty phase out. So let's put that on the side for now. It's a very important argument that underpins the rest of the story of structural transformation that must take place. The World Bank, a couple of years ago, produced also this report called Groundswell, which estimates the number of people who will be displaced by climate events by 2030 and 2050. And as you know, 2050 is, when it comes to the climate calendar, that's the day after tomorrow. And the numbers are overwhelming. We're talking about 86 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, 19 million people in North Africa, 40 million people in South Asia that will be displaced by climate events. And of course, experience and history tells us that every time you have mass movement of people at this scale, which we've never seen before, there's going to be serious problems. Why? Because the receiving cities and communities will be facing additional pressure on use of water, on housing, on schools, on health, on employment, on all of these fronts. And that usually sparks conflicts that we cannot afford to be honest at this level. So that's in terms of the urgency. Now the question is, are the receiving countries that will be receiving millions of people displaced because of climate events, do they have the fiscal capacity to build the infrastructure to welcome people with dignity in this unfolding global crisis? That is the question of economic preparation for this type of disruption that is unfolding. To be honest, some of this is already happening, as the World Bank clearly reports. So take this on a global scale, and I use the term neocolonial net wealth extraction, and I'll explain why I use neocolonial, not any other neutral diplomatic term. So divide the world in two groups, global north and global south. Let's call them rich countries and not so rich countries. And then when we net out global financial transactions, including trade and foreign direct investment, remittances, interest payments, debt relief, all of it included, the net amount is that green line. And the green line shows us the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. In other words, moving in the wrong direction. So as we're talking about scaling up climate finance and transforming the global financial architecture and delivering, aid to developing countries, the net amount is actually moving in the wrong direction. Why? Because there are deep structural patterns that are colonial and neo-colonial that continue to extract wealth from the global south. And notice that number, when I was still a student in the early 2000s, the number was $500 billion, and we thought it was outrageous. And then it goes to $1 trillion, and then 1.5, and now it's 2 trillion. In other words, if we don't transform the global trade, investment, and finance architecture that creates the suction mechanism, if we don't transform it, we're going to see this number go to $3, $4, $5 trillion in the years ahead. And that is clearly not something that is consistent with the type of transformation that all of us are interested in. So the question becomes, what are these deep structural mechanisms that are producing this perverse effect on a global scale? This is not a particular regime or a government or a country. This is a global structure that is by design creating these patterns. So to summarize the situation for us, just so we know, for example, on the climate front where we are, you have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. And then you have a promise of $100 billion from 2015 that was never delivered, not delivered yet. And then you have the Green Climate Fund, which last time I checked had about $11 billion in it for all global South countries, all climate vulnerable countries. And even the conference that took place a couple of weeks ago in Germany to raise funds for the Green Climate Fund barely reached $9 billion, I think, or not even $10 billion. And then, of course, you have the Loss and Damage Fund from last year's COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, which still has $0 in it. And from the recent meetings a few days ago, we're very, very far from reaching an agreement on how to fund the Loss and Damage Fund, who's going to pay into it and under what conditions, and who's going to be the recipient of funds from loss and damage. So the summary of the picture is very bleak, to be honest, and that requires not just small tweaking and small adjustments, but really a deep conversation and thought process about how do we get out of this very perverse global architecture that is not moving us in the right direction. So zooming in on the structural economic deficiencies that I want to discuss, and this is where the transformation needs to happen. This is where channeling all of our financial resources and strategies towards these structures is really imperative. So, of course, everybody is familiar with the high external debt problem that we have in the global South. But what I argue is the conversation that is happening at the World Bank, IMF, G20 level about external debt, especially for African countries, is useful and helpful in a sense, but it's really not sufficient, because all we're talking about is restructuring debt, providing relatively small debt relief for a particular set of countries, making sure that we have financial resources for the global South that are affordable on more favorable terms. All of this is helpful, but if we don't address the underlying structures, I guarantee you the debt crisis will continue to reproduce itself. Why? Because this debt problem, external debt problem, is a symptom of deeper structural issues. And these are three major root causes that we must address. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits, or in particular, low value added industrialization, that the global South in particular has been locked at the bottom of the value chain, either specializing in purely extractive industries and mining and so on, or assembly line manufacturing that races to the bottom using low-cost labor and heavy subsidies from governments. But let me go through them one by one. When I say energy deficits and food deficits, let me remind you that no country in the world can function without food, without energy. This is fundamental. This is the basic pillar of economic development and prosperity. Before we even talk about infrastructure and all the other important things, the foundations have to come from food and from energy. It's as simple as that. And when I say energy deficits, here I include even a country like Nigeria, which is one of the biggest exporters of oil and gas on this continent. Yet today, Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline. And it even imports gasoline that is illegal to sell in Europe. And this is not by accident, this is by design, let alone the countries that don't have even the fossil fuel resources. And if fossil fuels were going to be the source of development and prosperity for our continent, Nigeria would be an economic powerhouse today, delivering economic aid and assistance to its neighbors and all of that. But clearly, that's not the case. On the issue of food deficits, according to UNCTAD, Africa as a whole today imports 85% of its food. Again, not by accident, by design. And what I mean by that is that during colonial times, Africa used to be the breadbasket for former colonial powers. And as soon as the continent became independent, we reached a political independence. There was a meeting that happened in Europe in 1955, the basic foundations for the European Union, essentially. And one of the major concerns at the time was food dependency on Africa and other countries in the global south. And that started a series of conversations that led to the creation of the Common Agricultural Policy, the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day, a basic pillar of the foundation of the European Union. And of course, it wasn't just Europe that introduced these types of policies, which is heavy subsidies to farmers in Europe to produce core crops, wheat, corn, soybean, barley, as the major components of Europe's food sovereignty. It wasn't just Europe, of course, the US did the same, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine are so dominant in that sector, Australia, Canada, Japan, and so on, the major global north producers that dominate to this day. So that put our farmers immediately in a precarious position, because you can't compete with subsidized wheat from the global north or subsidized corn. So now you have two choices. You either move to urban areas and you move from being a skilled farmer to an unskilled laborer in urban areas, whether it's in hotels or manufacturing, assembly line manufacturing or service industry, or you remain in the agricultural sector, but now you have to switch crops. You have to give up farming wheat and corn and barley, and now you have to invest in cash crops for exports. And we've introduced all of a sudden this concept of food security, which is not the same thing as food sovereignty. Food security means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing it or by importing it or by borrowing money to import it or by receiving it as food aid, which is exactly what happened in the 60s. A lot of our countries became recipients of food aid during that transition away from food sovereignty. And of course, the worst thing that could happen to a farmer that is struggling to compete with cheaper wheat from abroad is to receive food aid for free, essentially, in their economy. And that was the end of their ability even to withstand that type of competition. Here's the problem when we move to cash crops for exports. And this is a key problem for the majority of African countries and a majority of global South countries, with few exceptions. Cash crops means you have to serve the taste of your consumers in the global north, which means you have to start using seeds that are not acclimated to your soil, to your land, to your climate. That's number one, which means you have to pump them with a lot of water, and you have to pump them with fertilizers that you must import. And eventually you start bringing even foreign seeds altogether. And number two, your product has to survive the journey all the way to a supermarket in Switzerland or London or somewhere else, which means you have to use pesticides so that you can produce this, magazine-looking piece of tomato or piece of strawberry that can actually make it to your final consumers. And when you do that, pesticides that are also imported, you've all of a sudden transformed your agriculture to becoming heavily dependent on imported seeds and pesticides and fertilizers, and you haven't invested in your own food security, and you're bleeding resources, water resources, essentially, when you're exporting these crops that are not native to your soil. And that's how you get to 85% of food imports. And it's even more dangerous than that, because when you pump your soil with pesticides and fertilizers for more than 10 years, you've destroyed the fertility of your soil, your yields start to decline, and now you have to double down on bringing more potent seeds and fertilizers and pesticides and cultivate even more acreage to make up for the lost yields. And that just locks you deeper into that problem. So that's on the food deficit end. On the industrialization front, as I said, we've been locked at the bottom of the value chain, thinking that we're industrializing. But the reality is, if your industries, your manufacturing sector is importing capital, importing fuel to power the factories, importing the intermediate components, the high-tech components, and importing even the packaging, and then we're using low-cost labor, competing across the global south, racing to the bottom for who's going to offer the lowest labor cost, who's going to offer the most subsidies from government for land, for water, for electricity, and subsidies, by the way, to the workers so that they can survive with lower wages. Workers are subsidized indirectly via their food subsidies and fuel subsidies and public subsidies across the system. In addition to, in some cases, we even subsidize their pensions and their healthcare and so on. So we're locked at the bottom of the value chain, competing against each other. We're importing high value-added content, and we're exporting low value-added content, which means no matter how much you double, triple, or quadruple your exports, you're digging yourself deeper into that structural deficiency. So the answer is staring at us right there, straight in the face. The answer to these structural traps is having a coherent, comprehensive strategy with South-South cooperation, channeling and prioritizing all of our resources to prioritize investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, investments in a different type of industrialization that allows us to climb up the value chain and escape that trap, and investments in our biggest potential, especially in this continent, in Africa, in renewable energy sovereignty. And I'll unpack this a little bit more. But if we don't, and so that we understand how the trap is formed, this is what happens when you have deficiencies in food, energy, and manufacturing. You have structural trade deficits, which is the case, and I'll show you some numbers in all African countries. And of course, a structural trade deficit puts downward pressure on the value of your currency. So you have a weaker currency relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And of course, with a weak currency, anything you need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine for your people, is going to be imported at a higher real cost. So this is how we get the food and fuel price inflation. This is the inflation pass-through effect. With a weak exchange rate, everything you import is more expensive. And that is dangerous. That is destabilizing socially and politically, which is why our governments immediately step in with the defensive policy, short-term policy that keeps us in that trap, unfortunately. And we need to avoid these band-aid solutions moving forward. So what do? We do two things. Number one, we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel to protect the most vulnerable, which makes perfect sense as an immediate intervention. But it can't be a policy for more than 50 years of constantly subsidizing with a band-aid solution. But the second thing we do is we ask our central banks to do their job in stabilizing the exchange rate. Now, how can a central bank stabilize the exchange rate? There's downward pressure. You intervene artificially and stabilize the exchange rate, and you do that by borrowing dollars and euros. And hence, the vicious cycle of external debt starts to accelerate. And the intervention of the central bank doesn't solve the problem in the long term. The intervention of the government with food and fuel subsidies doesn't solve the problem in the long run, because the next year we're going to have, again, energy deficits, food deficits, manufacturing deficits. So the long-term solution is designing a comprehensive, coherent strategy to actually invest in food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and a different kind of manufacturing industrialization structure. So that's really the main diagnosis, so to speak. And let me just lay it out with some figures. This is Africa as a whole, as a continent. I picked the year 2019 on purpose just to avoid the COVID disruption, but it's really the same. You can eyeball the problem. Our exports are primarily raw materials, extractive industries, low value added manufacturing. And notice the volume is 585 billion. Now look at the volume of Africa's exports, 737 billion, and look at the composition. The economic complexity of what we import is clearly much higher value. Look at the yellow boxes here, and you can go to the website and browse as you please. Notice what we import tends to be more of core crops from the global north, and what we export tends to be cash crops exported as raw materials. So that is Africa as a whole. I picked Ghana as an example. I could have picked any other country on this continent. You can, again, eyeball the problem right there. Raw materials for exports, cash crops for exports, and the volume is 25 billion. And what Ghana imports is 27 billion. And the economic composition and complexity is much more sophisticated. And Ghana also imports core crops like many, many countries on this continent. So this creates the structural trade deficit, which puts constant pressure, downward pressure on Ghana's currency. This is against the US dollar. And that's not a new phenomenon because of the recent debt crisis. This has been going on from the early days of independence for every single country on this continent. The flip side of Ghana's exchange rate depreciation is, of course, Ghana's external debt, and that is Ghana's central bank desperately borrowing money, trying to stabilize the exchange rate with very little success, as you can see. Now, what are the mainstream policies that we are often told we should use to get out of this poverty trap, to get out of this debt trap? We're told austerity. This is the number one condition. Austerity does exactly the opposite of what you need to build the building blocks of economic development. You reduce government spending on infrastructure, on health, on education, and the consequences are catastrophic. Debt restructuring is helpful. It's a little bit of relief, but it doesn't really get rid of the debt itself. It doesn't get rid of the root causes of the debt. So it's not a solution. Privatizing state-owned enterprises. This is, selling your airline, your airport, the water company, the electric company. It provides a little bit of cash relief. It's spent typically within a couple of years. And then once you do that, you can't privatize the airline again. You lose quite a bit of your strategic industries and strategic components of your economic sovereignty. So again, it's not a real solution. Labor market flexibility. This is the code word that economists use, as you know, to say reduce wages and protections for workers so that you're more competitive to attract more foreign direct investment and all that. That's not a sustainable strategy and it hasn't worked to begin with. Foreign direct investment and export-led growth. Again, if it's directed in the type of industries I've been describing earlier, which is low value-added manufacturing, it doesn't take you anywhere because export-led growth, every single country on the continent that tried it, as soon as you try to accelerate your exports, you end up accelerating your imports even more because you have to import the components for your manufacturing, the fuel for your manufacturing, and so on. And FDI is actually worse in the sense that it's more extractive than domestic export-led growth, because at least domestic export-led growth, the profits can be reinvested in the country. FDI profits are repatriated, so it produces the negative terms of trade that most of you are familiar with. And then there's the idea of financial liberalization. We're told set up a mini Wall Street and it will attract all kinds of investment and it will revive your economy and so on. The problem is when you have a weak economy and you artificially set up a market that attracts investors with artificial high returns that you manipulate by having your central bank set a higher interest rates and have an anti-inflation policy and deregulate and reduce taxes, you're essentially guaranteeing that the main people you're attracting are actually speculators want to buy low and sell high. And we've seen this in Brazil, in Mexico, in South Africa, and Turkey, and in so many other places. This is the hot money problem that comes in because there's money to be made, buy low and sell high, and then leaves you with a deep crisis afterwards, like it happened in Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and other places. Tourism. This is a tricky one, because on the surface it appears like tourism is the perfect solution for development. Why? Because you simultaneously bring millions of tourists, they bring foreign exchange with them, you create millions of jobs in hotels and entertainment centers and restaurants and so on. What's not to like about tourism as an engine of economic development? The problem is, when you bring 10 million tourists, you have to feed them food that you don't have, which means you import more food. When you bring 10 million tourists, you have to transport them and heat and cool the hotels for them, which means you have to import more fuel that you don't have. Now, if you had food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, yes, tourism can be a net benefit. But tourism, the type of tourism that we attract in our countries, with the economic conditions that we have, appears to be a great source of revenues for foreign exchange, but we forget that we're also bleeding foreign exchange when we have to import more food and more fuel and more high quality infrastructure to attract tourism revenues. So not a net benefit overall. Remittances, of course, is a serious problem of a brain drain. Is it really worth the remittances? And are remittances transformative for our economies? The short answer is unfortunately not. So we end up with a constant race to the bottom that leads to more external debt, and we're told there is no alternative. This is the only way. You have to grow yourself out of this trap. And I argue that there is an alternative, and I'll lay out an example. So are our countries prepared to accommodate mass climate migration? Do we have the fiscal capacity to pay for it without causing inflation and without bankrupting nations? And this is where the analytical tool that I use is this concept of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Of course, we're familiar with the idea of sovereignty. You have your territory, your flag, your national anthem, and all that. But monetary sovereignty, not all countries are equally sovereign. Some countries don't have any monetary sovereignty. Here I'm thinking of a country like Ecuador that dollarized its economy. It has no national currency. It uses a foreign currency altogether. Or think of the CFA franc zone countries and the 14 countries in Africa that still use a colonial currency, a French colonial currency. They have no monetary sovereignty. They're users of a foreign currency, in other words. And then, of course, you have countries with a high degree of monetary sovereignty, countries like the US, Japan, Australia, the UK, and so on. So the question is, what determines where you sit on that spectrum of monetary sovereignty? Because the higher the degree of monetary sovereignty, the more fiscal policy space you have to actually address your national priorities, to transform your economy on your own terms. What makes the difference where you sit on the spectrum is a couple of things. One is, you have to be able to issue your own national currency and tax in your own national currency, which is the case for the majority of countries, with the exception of countries that dollarized or have colonial currencies to this day. Number two, you have to be a country that is able to issue debt denominated in its national currency and only in its national currency. The reality is that our countries, the countries that lose a certain degree of monetary sovereignty, tend to be forced to issue debt denominated in dollars and euros and other foreign currencies, and that reduces our degree of monetary sovereignty and puts us on this end of the spectrum, the limited degree of monetary sovereignty. And number four, this is related to number three, which is, how desperate are you as a country to fix your exchange rate, to stabilize your exchange rate relative to the dollar and euro? Of course, most of our countries are desperate to do that, because if you don't, you have to import food or fuel or medicine the next day. You import inflation, you import social unrest and other problems. So the stronger the degree of monetary sovereignty, the more fiscal policy space you have. And that's really most of my focus, my research is, how do we take a country from this end of the spectrum, the weaker end of the spectrum, and use strategic investments, transformative investments that over time can allow you to acquire a higher and higher degree of economic sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, and therefore a higher degree of economic sovereignty and a larger fiscal policy space and more self-determination in terms of what you do with that fiscal policy space. So that's really the main focus, and I'm happy to outline a little bit more. So there's this idea that countries need to mobilize their own resources internally to tackle national priorities and to tackle climate change. Increasingly, we're told now in climate negotiations that every country needs to do its part. So interesting. So how do we do it? The question is government spending and deficit spending going to be able to tackle these national strategic priorities without causing inflation, without bankrupting countries? Here's what the mainstream of the economics profession approach tells us. And I use my own country here as a hypothetical example. Let's say Tunisia decides to spend 2 billion dinars on health and education. Let's say these are the big national priorities. And the immediate kind of logical flow of ideas from a mainstream perspective is going to tell us, well, Tunisia is going to have to import now more food, more energy, and more medical equipment, because you're employing more people, you're importing more. And that's going to have a larger trade deficit, weaker exchange rate, the inflation pass-through effect is going to kick in. And if you continue this, permanently, you're going to have hyperinflation. So more external debt overall, and the IMF and other foreign lenders will come in and mandate spending cuts and austerity, which brings us back to square one: less investment in health and education, more unemployment, brain drain, social, economic, and political tensions. And we're told there is no alternative. Don't even try it. It's not going to work. Margaret Thatcher told us this a long time ago. We should have learned our lesson. So that's the mainstream approach that tells you government spending cannot transform an economy and cannot be directed towards national strategic priorities. Health and education should be the sector of the private sector, and so on. And we've heard this before. Here's the alternative approach. I'm going to use the same numerical example: 2 billion dinars spent by the Tunisian government on national priorities, except now the spending is going to be more strategic. So we're going to spend 1 billion on health and education, the national priorities. The other billion is going to be spent on increasing domestic productive capacity of food, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and simultaneously cracking down on corruption, abusive price setters, and importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation, which is the purview of the government. So the exact same spending amount, except done slightly differently. Here's going to be the logical flow. We're going to have fewer imports of food and energy, which are two of the key weaknesses for our economy. We're going to have a lower trade deficit. We're going to have a stable or even stronger exchange rate. We're going to have no inflation pass-through effect, because that was the main inflation pass-through effect. Lower external debt, even higher credit ratings from credit rating agencies. And we're going to have an increase in foreign currency reserves at the central bank, more resilience to external shocks like the food and energy crises that we've seen in the last few years after the Ukraine crisis and the COVID disruption. You can have a lower carbon footprint, which is a nice benefit that comes out of this. And you can have more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life overall. So now the question becomes, is Tunisia's fiscal capacity only 2 billion dinars? Maybe it's 2.5, maybe it's 3. Who knows? Maybe it's 5. How do we know? What we know from research in this space is that the actual limit to how much deficit a country can safely undertake is the risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation comes from two basic sources. Number one, abusive market power, when you have key players who can raise prices simply because they can, which is why you need to tax and regulate that abusive market power out of existence, and that allows you a little bit more fiscal space. But number two, the risk of inflation materializes when you actually run out of productive capacity, that is skilled people, that is materials and resources to build in key strategic areas. In our case, it's food and energy, primarily the major sources of imported inflation. So the good news is that as long as you're building additional capacity to remedy the structural weaknesses that you have, food and energy in particular, and manufacturing that we talked about earlier, and as long as you're cracking down on abusive market power, corruption, and abusive price setters, and as long as you're building the healthy administrative capacity to actually administer, then you're able to to increase your fiscal deficit without causing inflation. And I'm about to wrap up here with a list of what not to do: not to accelerate the engines of external debt or extractivism, not to accelerate brain drain from the global south, not to encourage low value added assembly line industrialization, and not to accelerate cash crops, rather prioritize core crops, not encourage investments in stranded assets and fossil fuel infrastructure that is going to become obsolete in the next couple of decades, not to encourage consumerism, which is an important factor here, and not turn a blind eye on illicit financial transaction, corruption, abuse of market power, and not to perpetuate, of course, the engines of the status quo that we described here. So to conclude, the structural solutions, to summarize: strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, renewable energy sovereignty, and high value added industrial policies. And I'll say a couple of words about this because it's extremely important, especially for countries of the global south, to recognize that leapfrogging into a renewable energy world doesn't mean you import the solar panels and wind turbines from abroad. It means we have the opportunity to industrialize. Why? Because we have all the critical minerals, the strategic minerals needed. We have the market at scale. We have the demand at scale. And we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities on this continent in particular, across the global south, to industrialize, to deploy clean energy infrastructure, to deliver electricity to the 600 million people who don't have any access to electricity today, and to deliver clean cooking infrastructure to almost 1 billion people today who are inhaling toxic fumes because there is no access to clean cooking infrastructure. Again, this is not for export. This is to build the basic pillars of economic development and prosperity. And as I said earlier, transforming the global finance, investment, and trade architecture is critical. That's where the $2 trillion come from. That's the system that was designed primarily in 1944. Again, a system was designed when most of Africa was colonized. A system that was not designed by us, not designed for us, cannot be the system that will save us today and transform our economies today. So transformation, not just superficial reform. And this is just a picture of Africa's immense potential for renewable energy. This is our biggest asset, our biggest opportunity in the years ahead. And South-South strategic partnership, which is relevant to the ISDB here. Why is it important on the industrial front? Because industrialization requires economies of scale, and all of our economies individually cannot industrialize at that level. So using the complementarity of resources and capabilities, the horizontal linkages that must be built if you're going to create high value and retain high value within the economic bloc, and focus on collective resilience. Not every country can have food sovereignty, not every country can have renewable energy sovereignty, but regional blocs can produce this type of resilience. And that's how a country acquires over time a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. And if you lack this basic level of resilience, you have no bargaining chips. You can't walk away from a negotiation table, whether it's a climate negotiation or debt negotiation or any other negotiation. You continue to lose economic sovereignty. So to conclude, we're running out of time. I am also running out of time here. The crises, the multiple crises, the public crises that we're dealing with require urgent, bold, and radical transformation. And I don't mean radical in the political sense. I mean radical as in the literal sense, which means going to the root of the problem. Because if I'm not going to the root of the problem, I'm operating at the surface level. And at the surface level, that's superficial, and that's reproducing the status quo. That's what I mean by radical transformation. And all of these policies that we're unfortunately debating and discussing these days at the international level are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective, which makes them dangerous given the major issues that we're dealing with. So I truly believe that a realistic plan for a just transition requires the structural transformation of the global economic architecture that we're discussing. And I believe that a better system is actually within reach. This is like the real Wakanda is right there. We can see it. And I think it's possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kabok. I think it would deserve a round of applause. I think it was very exciting presentation. That's why I even didn't want to interrupt. I think, we started with some interrogation from Dr. Arif about did we get the diagnosis wrong or the policy wrong? I think you responded to a large extent. We have been focusing on some symptoms, that crisis, and we did not really look at the root causes. And if you look at the package from major development institution in the 80s through the 90s with the structural adjustment in austerity, debt restructuring, it did not address the issues, and maybe it was intended like this, as you mentioned, because we end up with this, what you told the neo-colonial wealth extraction with the 2 trillion. I think this is all very exciting, and I like the fact that you ended in terms of the solution with the South-South cooperation. So at this point, I'm happy to invite our colleague, Dr. Imad, who is working on the regional integration to also bring some ICTB perspective on this issue of structural transformation. So maybe Dr. Kabuk, if you can stop sharing so that Imad can also share his slide. Imad, up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sheikh. Let me share my presentation.
Just to mention that colleagues, we'll have a Q&A section after the presentation, one more to come from Brad. And then if you have questions also, you can use the chat box. So Imad, yes, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Sheikh, for this great opportunity to be part of this really interesting discussion around the topic that really getting more and more interest. And we also thank all the ARS team really for choosing this kind of topic to be discussed today. Thank you also to Brother Fadel for this comprehensive presentation. It is so difficult really to find any addition. The presentation was really so comprehensive that it covered almost everything. But I will just try to emphasize some of ideas that Brother Fadel already highlighted in his presentation.
Yes. Imad, sorry, are we having the good slide on the screen? Is it yours or for Bradley?
Is it mine?
Okay. Okay.
Is it the right one? I'm sharing the right one?
Let us check.
I think it looks like my, sorry to come in, looks like my slides, but just to confirm.
Yes, if you can double check, Imad. Yeah.
Is it? I'm sharing my
Now
presentation.
is correct. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So
this is your, okay. Yeah.
Sorry. So yeah. So as I said, that's mean I would just try to emphasize some of the ideas that already highlighted by Brother Fadel. That this is, I really confirm what you already said, that the idea of transformative change is getting really momentum currently at different levels, at the policy making level, and also with regard to the debate in terms of the roles of the MDBs. I did share an interesting conclusion from a report prepared by a panel of experts and presented during the G20, last G20, about the reforms of the role of MDBs, and they clearly conclude on the fact that the current development paths are no longer relevant to address the development challenges that at least this developing country are facing. Definitely, this debate is happening in a context where the concern about climate change is really dominating. But there are also other reasons behind this regain of interest into structural transformation or industrialization. In fact, there is a kind of, at the research level, there is a kind of disappointment not only from the perspective of policy makers seeking for a kind of action plan to generate prosperity, and they started on fact to putting into question these thoughts and questioning to what extent the research about growth is really offering the right path to sustainable growth. There is another reason behind this is that the reforms undertook during the 19th have not only focused on macroeconomic stabilization and the efficiency use of resources rather than expanding the production capacity of country. All of this together resulted in the kind of disagreement about to what extent this focusing too much on macroeconomic stabilization can bring stability or growth. By the way, that's mean this is not really, it may not really be relevant to talk about what should come first, having our macroeconomics right or getting our fundamentals right. Both of them are necessary for sustainability. What is new in terms of the debate around the structural transformation that it is happening in completely new context. This new context, in addition to what already Brother Fadel mentioned it about climate issues and climate protection, there are other global trends that also will impact to some extent structural transformation, particularly when it comes to digitalization, the redefining of the regionalism and the demographic pressure. These are to some extent challenges, but at the same time are opportunity for a successful structural transformation. I think that it will be addressed later on, but it's quite there is a large consensus around the fact that the proposed low carbon development model and digitalization are offering really an interesting and a lot of opportunity, particularly when it comes to the African country in terms of expanding their productivity base and accelerating the technological progress. And there is a consensus around the fact that the current digitalization at the global level will help, in fact, to boost productivity, creating more decent jobs, and in terms of providing more opportunity for regional cooperation and promotion of regional trade. There is also, as you can see currently at the global level, with all this geopolitics at the global level, there is a kind of redefinition of the role of regionalism. And we are in the era of what we call new regionalism, but with different circumstances and different perspective, where we can see that the geographical proximity is offering new opportunity for cooperation, for growth, for developing what we call regional manufacturing. And some of them also talk about what we call regional industrialization. Brother Fadel already alluded to this with regard to the fact that regional markets are offering really opportunity to go beyond the low size of national economy to develop some kind of economies of scale that will help really the industrialization of member country, particularly when it comes to Africa. Demography, definitely what is going on in terms of waves of migration from Africa to Europe is a big challenges. And this really calls for a kind of different way of or different models of development, because as we said, that the current development model are really failed to deliver on the expected outcomes in terms of prosperity, in terms of inclusiveness, and in terms of sustainability. So in conclusion, what I want to say that it is true that structural transformation is becoming really a hot topic today, and maybe this is the only way for many developing countries, particularly in Africa, to get out of this underdevelopment trap. But I think there are a certain number of mega trends at the global level that we need really to take into consideration while thinking about the right structural reform that we need to develop. Definitely, there is a debate currently about where we maybe agree on the fact that there is a need for structural transformation. There is still a debate about should we have a kind of this radical change or having more an incremental or gradual approach for transformation, given the fact that structural transformation by itself is really complex process. It is really involving a lot of stakeholders. Consensus is really important. Inclusiveness is very important. In addition, it is a long-run process that will really need a lot of resources and energy, and gradual approach may be more preferable for this kind of transformation. There is also some kind of consensus around that the current recommended transformational models are focusing too much on climate change. And they are not really looking really to what Brother Father really alluded to, which is really expanding the production capacity of developing countries, particularly in Africa, in order really to have a sustainable growth. As I said, the smoother is this transition, the more probability that this transition will succeed, given the fact, of course, that they will engage some kind of conflict of interest for different kinds of stakeholders. And if it is not monitored and managed wisely, it may not really succeed. Now, definitely, as I said, the main conclusion from the report from different experts and different readings is that this will really entail completely new operating model for the MDBs. Definitely, the MDBs and the regional organization deployed a lot of efforts to help member countries really to address their development challenges. But as we can see from the different results, particularly when it comes to Africa, there is a lot to be done. Now, I think, given the fact that the tendency is toward structural transformation and industrialization and focusing more on long-run transformative process, some suggestion to MDBs is more about having gone more long-term engagement with member country, adopting a kind of comprehensive approach. Currently, we are talking more about multi-country programs rather than project country approaches, because it is quite clear that the complexity of the transformative development approaches that member country will adopt will need a package of support and services that will go beyond providing financial support. IDB has this kind of tools, which is the MCTS that already Sheikh mentioned. It is a really very good platform to engage in the long-term perspective in terms of supporting member countries in their transition toward more sustainable growth. There is also a call for improving our analytical support to our member country, given that there are emerging challenges that the existing and standard tools and instruments cannot really address, and will need really some analytical work in terms to come up with some innovative solution to these emerging challenges, like what we see with the COVID-19 and the current challenges that we are facing in terms of climate change. This also will need a kind of enhancing our support and our operating model in terms of agility and flexibility. Now we need really to speed up the approval process. We need to have a kind of more simplified business process, process that can really easily be accessible to our member country, and that can really help us to be more responsive to the needs of our member country. Brother Father already mentioned the need for more cooperation and coordination among all the MDBs and among all the RCOs. South-South cooperation is one of the main instruments that the Islamic Development Bank is using in terms of supporting developing in member country, and it turned to be really very effective in terms, particularly transferring knowledge and best practices to address development challenges. And here we can say that the bank has a really footprint in terms of developing this area, particularly through the reverse linkage modality. There is also increasing demand to engage differently with the private sector. The challenges that our member countries are facing, but definitely they cannot be addressed by the public sector, and the private sector is really will be kind of key player, particularly when it comes to mobilizing additional resources in terms of improving efficiency when it comes to the implementation of project, and in terms also of risk sharing. The private sector here can really play a key role. In this regard, I think the MDBs and IDB particularly is really called to put the collaboration, the cooperation with the private sector at the core of its operating model in order really to be able to address the increasing challenges in a member country, particularly when it comes to supporting the transition toward a low carbon development model. Definitely, finance remains a key factor for success and for the MDBs to be relevant to their member country. There is more emphasis on mobilizing more private finance, given the fact that currently the resources at the level of MDBs are really very limited, and it is far below the what is needed for this energy transition and the structural transformation needs from member countries. There is also the external debt issues, and the capacity of our member country to borrow is really very limited, and it is quite clear that there is an increasing demand on concessional finance. And so this, in this regard, the MDBs and the Islamic Development Bank is called to be more innovative in order to mobilize additional concessional finance to support developing to member countries. Domestic resource mobilization, as highlighted Brother Fadel, is also key, as I said, as already clarified, in terms of getting this kind of independency from external finance, and to have to generate the domestic engine for growth that can really make the growth path more sustainable. Finally, I think we need really to have the capacity to think out of the box. As I said, we are facing emerging challenges where the all tools will not really be enough to deal with. We need really to come up with innovative solutions at different levels, and this is where we think that a kind of creation of a kind of platform for sharing knowledge, expertise, best practices, it can help to some extent develop this kind of innovative solution at the level of South-South. And we can see that the current mechanism that the bank has in terms of reverse linkage can play a role to generate this kind of innovative solution to address this development challenges. So, Brother Sheikh, I will stop here and give you back the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Imad, for very insightful comments. So we'll come back to this. So in the interest of time, I turn directly to Brother Brad. Okay, so if Imad, you can stop sharing so that Brad, okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, colleagues. I'm just trying to share my screen, and I'll be very brief. Okay, thank you so much, colleagues, Dr. Fadel and Brother Ahmed, and also thanks to Sheikh and Brother Arif for facilitating. So what I'll do is just bring the just transition element back to ISDB and what we're doing here and what are some of the drivers for us. So very quickly on the report that was covered, I drew out some key comments. I think it's very clear Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change and also has been a minimal contributor to greenhouse gas emissions to date. I think this nexus of climate, energy, and development, and then linking this to food and industrialization is very important. And also where there's areas of overlap with ISDB is around this focus on energy, which is accessible, affordable, reliable, and sustainable. So I think these are really critical points. The report talks about the African century, and I think leveraging the strengths that are described there around the wealth of renewable resources, in addition to the new economy, minerals or resources, youth, and also land availability is really important. But then so laid across the top of that is recognition of the human rights and environmental concerns. And I think in the report they talk about something which is a new term to me. They said good and bad renewables. So looking at good renewables in this sense. The other thing that Dr. Fadel also mentioned was, and this came up last week at MENA Climate Week when we spoke around just transition as well, is the plurality or the multiple just transitions. So each country will start at a different point and then also aim to get to a different endpoint as well. So this is very important to be able to cater for this. In terms of financing, Brother Ahmed covered some of this around sort of the combination of domestic and international resources, and then a range of sources, whether it's scaling up existing models, introducing innovative models, accessing climate funds, etc. And I think the report talks about this reimagination of a new framework for African resilience and prosperity. So I think from the ISDB side, many of the elements in the report are sort of aligned with some of our strategies, policies, and action plans, ranging from South-South cooperation or the reverse linkage mechanism that Brother Ahmed mentioned, the support for SDGs, the establishment of regional programs. This is around food security program, for example, but also a proposed regional renewable energy program, multiple financing modalities, and then I'll touch a little bit on our proposed just transition approach as well. So if we look at the context of drivers for ISDB engagement on just transition, ISDB is committed to become Paris aligned by the end of this year. And as you may or may not know, just transition is included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So in the middle here, you can see what the MDBs have termed building blocks for Paris alignment. So this includes actions on mitigation, adaptation, etc. But building block 4 focuses on strategy, engagement, and policy development, under which are things such as NDCs, long-term strategies, and also just transition. Further to this, the MDBs have also established just transition high-level principles, which again are derived to help guide the MDBs on this just transition journey. Next, a lot of the work we do is driven by the countries themselves. So NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions, are documentations, and there's other national climate documents as well, which help which countries derive themselves and then give us an indication of where they want support. The next two graphics might be a little bit small on the screen, but they show which countries include just transition as a concept in their NDCs already. And the NDCs are being updated periodically. And you can see that in places such as Europe and Central Asia, it's a commonly used term, possibly around coal transition, for example. But in African countries, there are cases where it is referred to, but it's not as common. Also, in terms of ISDB, we have a lot of, as I said, strategies, policies, and things internally. Our current organizational strategy includes a pillar on green, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure, and also on inclusive human development. And we have various climate plans and sector policies, which also have relevance to just transition. In 2022, it was estimated that more than 70 MDB activities supported just transition explicitly. And so this sort of approach here of operational approaches, financing, collaboration, policy support, and knowledge are areas where MDBs are active in just transition. So where are we currently focusing at ISDB? across 3 of these areas at the moment, with ambition to cover all 5. But firstly, we're looking at knowledge. We're currently working on a knowledge product for launch at COP28 with the International Labour Organization. And this is looking at quantitative modeling of countries' NDCs in MENA, and how, if these are met, how this would influence labour policy, employment, and many other social issues. So this is really quite interesting. Collaboration, we're a member of an MDB working group on just transition, and this is intended to provide consistency, comparability, information exchange, and we're also participating in multiple sort of public forums on just transition as well. And in terms of operational approaches, which I'll focus on in my last slide, we've conducted 2 internal workshops with external guests and internal departments this year, and we're aiming to launch a just transition framework at COP28 this year. So I'll just focus on that. This is my last slide. So the initial aim of our just transition framework approach is to support member countries' transition towards low emission, climate resilient development pathways in a just, fair, and inclusive manner. This is not set yet, but this is sort of our overall goal. I think for us, it's very important. We have 57 member countries who are all at different stages of development with different goals. Some are fragile and conflict affected, some are carbon intensive, some are at the early stage of transition, and some, as we've discussed today as well, are very low energy access. So what we want to do is identify enablers and modalities to support our member countries' just transition. And then the idea is to build upon a framework. Next steps will be linkages to operations and financing, which were 2 of those other boxes you saw in the other slide. And just before I finish, I'd just like to refer to the African Development Bank, seeing as though we're talking about Africa today, and we do collaborate with African Development Bank quite a bit. They have a Just Transition initiative which is established, and it's very strong on recognizing the African context and aiming for similar goals that were outlined in some of the reports, but also realizing that some countries will face fossil fuel transition, but others that are non-fossil fuel countries do have an opportunity to leapfrog, as Dr. Fadel talked about today. And so we need to be able to cater for these different arrangements. So we welcome internal, external colleagues to our COP28 Just Transition event, and I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Brad, for bringing this ICB perspective on just transition, highlighting, the structural differences of our member countries and the need to take that into consideration. Also, like the emphasis on collaboration and knowledge. So I think this is consistent with what was developed by both Dr. Imed and Fadel. So now I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A session. So colleague, the floor is open if you have question, comment on both on the 3 presentation. Please, you can raise your hand or just take the floor. So Dr. Brother Said, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheikh, and I really appreciate all the presenters, Fadel, Ahmad, and Brad. Really very informative. I missed a portion of Fadel's presentation, but if we can get copies of it, I'll be very happy to go through it. This is such an important aspect and avenue for a bank like us to pursue. We've heard this repeated many times, how we, being the voice of the South, from the South, we need to own this entire arena of fair and just transition. And I'm glad that there is some organic work which is coming through. It's one of those things that we heard this also. I don't know whether somebody was captured this in their remarks, but in Africa Climate Summit or Africa Climate Week, the African nations got together and made a lot of important points on this issue, particularly about the promise of renewable energy in Africa and what would it take to do that structural transformation to be able to reach there. And I think it was the president of Kenya particularly who emphasized and elaborated upon some of these things. But then you need JETPs, Just Energy Transition Programs, the way it is in South Africa and the way it is, it was highlighted in Indonesia last year at the G20 as well. So we need to replicate those mechanisms where all the various actors development financiers, private sector, domestic resource mobilization, concessional financing opportunities can come through, and we work together on those items. I was particularly also impressed by Dr. Imad's reading of the IHREG report and some of the recommendations that came through in it. I've read through that report, but I didn't particularly find anything that on Africa as such. But if you had any observations, please do share. One recommendation that I would like us to sort of, when we leave this particular opportunity, is to have is so the RCA and the operations complex will work together on the just transition approach of the bank, right? In terms of how we will do the financing, how we will be able to sort of pursue operations and projects as such. Yes, that's fine. That's one aspect of the job. But there is a huge capacity development and internal understanding component that I think we need to work together with the colleagues in ERS and with RCI particularly, because it has this new regionalism component that Dr. Imad was talking about, and RCI has also some very good economists that we can. So one proposal that I would like to leave the audience with is we can have a joint, like the study that Brad was mentioning, we have a technical study on MENA. But the next time we do a study like this, whether it is particularly, let's start with Africa, we do it with ERS and with RCI. If ERS and RCI have any views and thoughts on that, please do share, and I will be very happy to pursue it outside of this webinar. But I really want to appreciate the organizers of this webinar to giving us these ideas to think through and come up with these suggestions as such. Thank you very much again for organizing. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Brother Said. I think we have like a good comment and a concrete proposal on which we'll have to think about and come back. So any other comments or question? So maybe I'll start by the time colleagues react. I think we have seen two perspectives from Dr. Fadel and Imed about, you know, the space of the reform. It could be the pace. I mean, it could be incremental or leapfrog. So Dr. Kabuki mentioned also the issue of that we are running out of time. So we really need bold action. Now, if I take the example from Tunisia, so I think you mentioned a couple of things that makes a policy reform, like how use this fiscal space, but also you mentioned some issue about governance, fighting corruption, etc. So, and this is very complex. So, how easy is it in terms of the sequencing or the prioritization? What should come first? Because we see these issues in many African countries that governance is a key obstacle to policy implementation. So, how do you see the sequencing? Fadel, yeah.
It's a very good question. Should I go first? Ashay? Yeah.
Yes. Go first.
So gradualism or rapid transformation. There's the in between. You start gradually and you gradually accelerate and scale up, but you do it in the right direction. And I'll raise an issue that is prevalent across the continent of Africa, not just Tunisia. If we decide we're going to prioritize investments in food sovereignty, for example, and we're going to have a national policy to commit to it, there's this idea that, you know, somebody from the outside will be applying pressure not to do it, but the pressure is actually from the inside. Because if I happen to be one of the handful of individuals who have the exclusive license to import wheat or rice or corn into the country, and usually it's somebody related to, you know, the centers of power, economic and political power, then why would I let the country take my market share and support small farmers to produce more domestic crops when it's not in my interest? So I'm going to use my economic and political influence or whatever it takes to make sure that national agricultural policy doesn't go through. And this is true for the energy sector. This is true for any other sector. So we have to be realistic about, you know, the implementation of these great ideas may not happen unless you have a strong political commitment and transparency and anti-corruption measures put in place, and sometimes maybe even striking deals with powerful cartels to transform their cartel from a rent-seeking, abusive cartel to a new form of public-private partnership. Say, here's the opportunity for you to become an investor in this new venture that the government is introducing for restoring food sovereignty in the country. So that takes a strong political leadership to do that, and it can't be ignored, because the countries that ignored it and tried to invest in this, that, or the other, their experience have been a failure. And the experience of Nigeria, for example, with investments in domestic rice was a failure precisely because of this, and we can cite other examples. So you have to clear the pathway for that large-scale intervention. So that's where gradualism makes sense, but also not to be too slow in this gradualist approach, because as Martin Luther King once said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism, because they tend to be, they start gradual and they stay gradual and they never scale up. And sometimes that's part of the problem. So we have to start carefully and strategically and clear the pathway for scaling up rapidly. So if that's a compromise, then I'm happy with it. And then finally, the last point, which I just lost. So I'll give you the mic, and then if it comes back, I'll circle back.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Brother Imad, you want to come in also on this point about the pace of reform? I think also you mentioned the changing role of MDBs. You know that some of these have been also supporting reform. So how also can they come in just like supporting this transformation that is needed? So what need to be changed at their level to be more transformative in Africa?
Thank you, Brother Sheikh, and thank you for this question. Definitely, there is no really one size fits all. And different countries, even within Africa, they have different structures and different contexts. But what we want to emphasize is the fact that the complexity of the structural transformation needs really to be monitored very carefully. It involves a lot of many stakeholders. It needs a lot of resources, a lot of investment. You need a lot of energy if you want to industrialize. You need a good infrastructure. You need good institution. You need skills. You need a lot of things. That's mean the experience from Asia shows that it is really a very long process, and we need to be patient in order really to make this structure move. Definitely, what you said with regard to the role of MDBs, I think we are in completely new context. It's not just because there is a need for structural transformation, but the environment, the context is completely different. With all these challenges that we are emerging, the majority of them are emerging. We talk about climate change, of course, because there is a long debate about this, and it's really dominating to some extent the narrative around development and structural transformation. But there are other factors that we need to take into consideration. Try to mention that's mean the regional dimension, the geopolitics at the global level, the emergence of new players, big players at the global level. They have different kinds of strategies. What is going on in terms of that there are some development challenges that cannot really be addressed at the country level. It can be addressed only at the regional level. So where the regional dimension really will be critical. And there are a lot of initiatives like the free trade area in Africa. It is offering a lot of opportunity. We cannot really think about structural transformation without taking into consideration there are a lot of opportunity where we can really develop a kind of economy of scale. So give opportunity for our industry really to flourish. There are also this digitalization will really save a lot of time. for us in terms of development and in terms of transformation. And as I said, South-South cooperation will also help a lot to make a lot of savings in terms of time and in terms of effort and energy, because in fact we have a lot of experience to be shared. We have best practices that now we can really share among ourselves. We have really very interesting and innovative solutions that will make you really transformation easier in terms of time that we take and in terms of effort that we need to be accomplished. So all that, so we need really to take into consideration that the context is different. So from this perspective, the structural transformation cannot really be understood from the perspective that's mean from our own thinking about what does it mean structural transformation, which in general we talk about industrialization. Now, as I said, climate change is offering a lot of opportunity for structural transformation with a new opportunity in terms of renewable energy. Fadel already mentioned it, that there are huge potential in Africa in terms of using this renewable energy to develop our industry. So from this perspective, I said that gradual approach is definitely needed, because we said given the complexity, the reality on the ground complexity of the transformation, and given the fact that many stakeholders are really involved in this, and managing conflicts of interest is not easy to manage. And here where we can see that MDBs can play a role in terms of fostering this policy dialogue, promoting cooperation and coordination between the private sector and the public sector and the civil society in terms of the way forward for the development, how to address the shortcomings that may really result from the transformation, because it will have a cost. Definitely, it will have a cost. How the cost will be addressed, who will pay for this cost, who will benefit, and who will not, who will pay the cost. I think this is a question that also where the MDBs can play a role. Coordination of the MDBs is also fundamental. They can really, rather than competing on a specific project in specific area, they need really to think about how they can work together for co-financing of this project, how they can really engage together in terms of policy dialogue with member countries, how they can together address development challenges there rather than. So I think there is also a need for, in terms of shift in terms of mindset of our thinking and our way of doing business that will impose also on the MDBs. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brother Imed. I see that Brother Brad is raising his hand. It's good, because I was coming to you with a question. So, and Imed has alluded to it, because now we thought about structural transformation as mainly industrialization, and now you have this transition coming in. So in this approach of just transition, how do you take into consideration so the other structural challenges that cannot be separated from this issue? So how you take into the consideration this complexity in the approach of just transition? Over to you, Brother Brad, and then Ismail will take the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sheikh. I just wanted to come in on that last point, actually, which is a positive note. And a quick point is that at COP28, we expect that the MDBs, so the multilateral development banks as a collective, are proposing to a platform where there's better collaboration and coordination in countries, potentially at regional level, but certainly in countries, around climate action. So I think this can contribute to sort of improved just transition activities. In terms of structural challenges, I guess this is a little bit beyond my remit in the climate change and environment division, but I certainly think reading the report, there's sort of two choices. One is if Africa shifts more to a renewable energy type pathway, and another one is development of fossil fuels. And I think in the report, they make quite a few positive points for transitioning to renewables around sort of sovereign ownership over resources, upskilling and reskilling, possibly avoiding stranded assets and, future costs that may be associated with fossil fuel developments. And then also, having access to new sources of finance as well. So I think there's many benefits there. And I think in this sense, it can be a structural shift in a positive direction. The other thing that we also want to emphasize, and I know the report focused on energy, but also we have to think, just transition can also extend to other sectors such as agriculture, transport, industry, manufacturing, and these sorts of things. And particularly in countries where, say, for example, agriculture still plays a large part in the economy, we also want to extend to those sectors as well. So I won't go into too much detail on that now. Happy to discuss that with colleagues. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Dr. Fadhil, etc. as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Ismail, please go ahead. Brother Ismail. Ismail, maybe you have issues with your mic because we cannot hear you. So while maybe Ismail figure out how to fix his technical issue, maybe Fadel, if you have more final comment to share with us, we are now running out of time. We are close to
Sure.
ending this session. So yeah, please.
Yeah, just completing the thought from earlier about the gradualism. I always say that the long term starts today, starts yesterday, because these are long-term structural transformations. What I mean by that, think of every metric ton of wheat you produce locally, every green kilowatt hour you produce locally saves you its equivalent in dollars you had to borrow and interest you had to pay for decades in some cases. So every country can probably marshal a little bit of the resources to shift away from activities that have been getting us deeper into those structural traps, like the subsidies of cash crop exports, for example, and shift to producing just 100 metric tons of wheat this year, and do that well and design a strategy to accelerate and scale up. But again, there existing institutional structures that make it very difficult to do that. In my own country, in Tunisia, if we wanted to do that, to invest in wheat production, there is no technical assistance, no support, no subsidies, no loans, no water, no land, nothing. But if we say today, I want to export strawberries or watermelon, all the subsidies will materialize, the land, the fertile, the fertilizers, everything, the logistics support, the financial assistance, because we've been locked into that cash crop exports because we need the dollars and euros to pay the debt to import the wheat and from the Ukraine or from Russia or from Europe. So we need to have an actual agricultural policy that strategically designs that transition, and that is a transition in of itself. And there's again power and influence of exporters of watermelon and strawberries and everything else, because they want those subsidies and support and benefits, and that's their influence. So they're going to use whatever capacity they have to influence government decisions not to invest in wheat production, for example. And I can go country after country after country. There's lots of internal problems that will come into play when you try to invest in that type of food sovereignty. And we have to be fully aware and prepared and design a just transition for those exporters too, for their workers too, for those industries. So it's not just investing in food sovereignty and throwing everybody else under the bus. How do you transition and transform your agricultural policy in that direction? Same thing for energy, same thing for industrialization and so on. And I see that Brother Ismail is able to connect with us, at least video-wise. Maybe we can hear
Ismail?
you.
Yeah.
Ismail, we are not hearing you. Maybe you can write your question very briefly if it is not possible to use your mic.
So we see that digitalization is not an easy transformation. So if Ismail can take the floor by the end, but otherwise, just to thank everybody, I think. Ismail, yeah? We still cannot hear you. So please kindly write in the chat box. So just I was saying, just thanking all the panelists for this very insightful comment and thought. I think we had a very useful session, and we'll be using this material, and I hope we'll have other opportunities to go further, as we have some initiative running like this just transition, where we may be collaborating with RCI and our brothers in climate change division. So thank you also very much, Fadel, for joining us today. We really appreciate the presentation and the insightful thought that are very useful. So I will close here and thank everybody for joining. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And thanks to our brothers who supported and organized, Brother Haq and Brother Habib and all of you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Awesome.